why people do the stupid things that they do. How about yourself? Have you ever wondered why you do the stupid things that you do? I want to tell you a little story that happened about 3 months before my great awakening that I talked about in the last episode. My wife and I were attending ministry school in California, as I mentioned, and we were back home for the summer. And we had to drive back to California for the fall session. And that's a 30-hour drive. So if you've ever been in a long car ride with your family, you know that all kinds of interesting things can happen. Well, I'm a planner, and I strongly believe when you're traveling that you should make as few stops as possible. Because if you made all the stops that my family would like to make, you would simply never arrive at your destination. You would just be driving forever, and you would never get there. In fact, that trip that we made all those years ago, we'd still probably be driving if we made all the stops that my family would like to make. I'm being a little over the top here, but that's actually what we're talking about today. Those times in our lives when we get a little bit over the top. So my wife wanted to stop at a Starbucks. And I said, if we wait like 60, 70 miles and stop at this other Starbucks, stop further down the road, it'll time up better for when we need gas so that we won't have to stop and get gas any more times than is absolutely necessary. And she kind of begrudgingly went along with it. However, as we passed the exit to the Starbucks in question, I quickly learned that she was not okay with passing that Starbucks. And this Starbucks became the root of an argument that was very, very, very big. Very big. So big that at one point I thought divorce attorney would have to get involved. And I'm not joking. I'm very, very thankful that my children had headphones on and were asleep in the back seat and did not have to hear their parents arguing like 5-year-olds in the front seat. So eventually, things calmed down a bit. I think the next Starbucks stop helped pacify that. But why do sometimes things get so big? Things that are little. If we get in our right mind, we can step back and look at it and be like, gosh, why did I get so bent out of shape about that? That was just silly. What was I thinking? That's probably happened to you. If it hasn't, well, you're fortunate because it feels like it happens to me all the time. It happens to me a lot less now because I'm much more aware of what's happening inside of myself in those moments. So when I first met Laura, one of the things that I was introduced to was some brain science. And it was actually this discussion that Laura had around brain science that was incredibly impactful to me because my logical brain looked at some of the things Laura did and I thought they were a little weird, to be honest. I didn't relate. Learning to speak compassion to yourself, learning to love yourself, getting to know yourself. It just all sounded kind of strange to me. But when she started talking to me, or actually it was a seminar that I was in as a workshop, when she was speaking at that workshop and she spoke about brain science and what was going on in your brain in the moments like I had in the car over the Starbucks incident, when she started talking about the brain science, what was happening, it really, really made a lot of sense. And as I mentioned, before I met Laura, I had pursued several other counseling options because that was one thing when I had gone to the ER that they were very adamant that I do was pursue counseling options. So I had pursued some, and nothing was really landing. It all kind of just sounded like mumbo jumbo. Now, that's not a slight on any of those people. It's just where I was at, because in a different frame, perhaps they could have been very helpful to me. But in the frame I was in, it wasn't. But I recognized when I met Laura and she started talking to me from a scientific standpoint, that really resonated. And Laura, being so difficult to get into, she did say I had to wait a while to meet with her one-on-one, but I was able to go to one of these workshops. And at that workshop, she taught me the brain science behind what happens to me when I'm triggered. So let's start off talking about what a trigger is. So I'm going to read from Above All Else, and I'm just going to read what I wrote about a trigger. So according to the compassion method, which is the method that Laura devised, a trigger is an irrational response to a rational or irrational person, situation, or circumstance. It's that disorienting space of time when we're not fully present with ourselves, when we're not okay, clear-minded, tender-hearted, or at peace. That's how the compassion method defines being okay. When you're clear-minded, tender-hearted, or at peace. That definitely described both my wife and I in that incredibly triggered moment regarding the Starbucks. And a lot of times these triggered moments, you look back at them and you laugh, because I can totally laugh about that. Like, that was so silly. But man, at the time, it's anything but silly. It is so, so high stakes. And when you can learn to start recognizing your triggers, that's one of the dead giveaways. When something feels so high stakes that if it doesn't happen, like life on earth is going to end. And that's what that Starbucks incident was for my wife and I. So I'm going to read on. When Laura first taught me this concept, her explanation of the brain science behind a triggered reaction spoke directly to my logical mind. When we're triggered, we're operating from our primal brain, the survival wired part of us where our fight or flight mechanism lives, centered in the amygdala. Humans develop this part of their brain first, which is why it's called the primal brain. And other people in the science world also call it the child brain for that reason. And it's not just because when we're there, we're acting like a child. It's also just because it was the first to be formed. And then the frontal lobe, which is up here, your primal brain's more at the base of your head. Your frontal lobe is up here. This is where more complex behaviors are. So behaviors like planning and decision-making, and it develops much later. So like for me, it maybe was going to develop next year, but for most, it's going to develop in their early 20s. And so when you think about it, when some of the frustration we have with teenagers and some of those type of things, in some cases, you're just dealing with somebody that does not have their fully developed frontal cortex. So you're thinking, why can they not get this? Why does this not click for them? So as the way God designed things with parents, we're supposed to help them and be the adult brain for our children. They don't have that part of their brain. So we get to be that part of their brain for them. As theirs develops, we then pull back. And we no longer need to be that part of their brain, which me having children right now in the range from age 15 to 29 and seeing that gamut, I wish I knew for my poor 29-year-old what I know now. I mean, I feel really bad. I feel really bad because she was the test tube dummy. She was the guinea pig, so to speak. And my wife and I got to try out all of our parenting hacks on her and learn what worked and what didn't work. But it has been really fun as my children age. And now that I'm more aware of this, I can learn to start pulling back. Like when they ask me questions that, when a 15-year-old asks a question, I'm going to answer it a little bit differently than when a 25-year-old asks that question. Because now that I know more about brain development, I know more how to answer that question and really more of what they're capable of knowing in that moment. But anyway, so that part of our brain develops later. So that fight or flight part back here, we absolutely want fight or flight to kick in if a lion is really chasing us. That's rational. But when it's firing during an argument about whose turn it is to do the dishes, that's irrational. The bigger your triggered reaction, the deeper you are in that primal mode, the more you're operating from this part of your brain. Or another way to look at it, the younger you are, because you're operating more and more out of that child brain or that primal brain. So in that car ride, my wife and I were very, very stuck back here. The fact that what we were doing was so illogical and so silly and trivial, which up here knows we had no access to that. We were stuck. We were 5-year-olds. It's like our primal brain, or it was like our adult brain, our frontal lobe didn't even exist. Okay. So the more we're stuck in that primal brain, the younger we are, the littler we feel, and kind of like the younger developmentally, we're trapped in that spot. And the further removed we are from who we were truly created to be, our true self. So shortly after learning all of this, like literally it felt like it was just a few days after that seminar that I was at, where Laura taught this, I found myself in the kitchen with my daughter, who was at the time probably 18 or 19, I think 18. And this particular daughter, of course, I have several daughters that are this way. But anyway, when they go through the kitchen, it's kind of like a tornado just went through. So we were having a conversation about the tornado and the results of the tornado, the aftermath of the tornado that went through the kitchen. So we're having this argument about picking up after herself. And yes, it's good that people pick up after themselves. However, this conversation, this argument, so to speak, kind of devolved into kind of a bickering match back and forth. And all of a sudden it hit me. There was no longer a 40-some-year-old adult and a teenage daughter, in the kitchen arguing with themselves. It was 2 4-year-olds bickering. And what I said in the book, it was convicting and revelatory in equal measure. So that argument was both convicting and revelatory in equal measure. So I write on, I said, have you ever thought to yourself after doing something really stupid, how could I have done such a thing? I know better than that. That's likely true. You do know better than that. But when you're stuck in your primal brain, you're hijacked. You're stuck in that survival wired part of your brain. You're hijacked, and your access to your adult, sophisticated brain gets cut off. I wrote, you may be the utmost authority on emotional health. But if your amygdala has taken the wheel, the primal brain, if it's taken the wheel, that wisdom is locked away, useless in the moment. This explains why some of the most brilliant people still make tremendously poor choices and messes of their lives. So learning that, and I hope you hear me on this, that learning that is not an excuse for your trigger behaviors. It is not an excuse for when you do something stupid. But what that understanding brings you is awareness. Because I think for a lot of us, myself especially, I saw my triggered behaviors as who I was. I'll give you another example from a workshop with Laura. And this was the first workshop I took my wife to. I shared with her that these workshops were really helpful, and she was all on board to help me in whatever way she could. So she came along with me more as moral support than anything. So she comes to the workshop, and I had been to, I think this was probably my third workshop. And Laura, if you've ever been in any type of a one-on-one session or a group session with Laura, she is going to ask for audience participation. So she was looking for examples, and I agreed to be her example for the day. So she was challenging us to identify times where we had triggered behavior. And I shared a time with the family where I was really grumpy. And I said these words. I said, I am just a grumpy person. And then I was going to go on and share the example. And she stopped me. She didn't let me go any further. She stopped me, looked me dead in the eye, and said, you are not a grumpy person. That is not who you are. You're just hurting. And in your pain, you're stuck in that primal part of your brain, and it comes across as being a grumpy, irritable person. And I felt like, number one, I could just feel the compassion come over me. I was just overwhelmed with it. Like, oh my God, I thought this is who I was. But maybe it's not who I was. Maybe it's not who I am. Maybe it is just a reaction. And I looked at my wife, and she actually kind of had her head down. She was being convicted as well. Because you see, in my grumpy and irritability, my family playfully had developed some names for me. And one of them was the fun sucker. Because when I would walk into a room or get home from work, I would suck all the fun out of the room. So they would tell me things like, Dad, put away your straw, because I was just sucking the fun right out of the room. And when I was looking at her, I could tell she was getting convicted too of like, oh, I kind of reinforced that, those feelings that he potentially had of that I am a grumpy person. But we were all learning, we were all growing, and it was incredibly impactful to think of the fact that, no, I'm not a grumpy person. That's not who I am. That's just where I go to in my triggered reactions. So the whole point of this is not to make excuses for what we do. One of the things Laura says a lot, and that's really always resonated with me, she says, what you do matters, but who you are matters more. So what we do matters. If we did something, if we made a mess and we need to apologize, or we need to clean up our mess, none of what we're talking about excuses any of that. And totally do not hear that from me, because that is not what we're talking about. We're not talking about not owning your mistakes. But if you do the work of comforting your heart, the work we're going to be talking about in the coming episodes, and that I talk about it above all else, and that Laura's dedicated her life to teaching, if you do that work, your requests for forgiveness will be real. They'll be genuine. You won't just be doing it because it's the right thing to do. You'll be doing it for the right reasons, because you recognize you made a mess, that your triggered self made a mess, and that's not who you are. And you'll be able to own it without shame. Just be like, hey, I made a mistake, but I'm not a mistake. In the past, sometimes my forgiveness was 100% coming from my shame, or my request for forgiveness, because I was almost kind of like begging the other person in a way to not look at me and to not reinforce my shame. That if I say I'm sorry, I can get like some penance for my shame. So really my forgiveness, I found, was sometimes more about me than about truly, genuinely grieving over the hurt that I caused another. Now, when I have to ask for forgiveness, it's from a much clearer space. It's from a place of being okay, clear-minded, tender-hearted, and at peace. Because I still make mistakes. I still have triggers. But if there's anything that I have grown in throughout this compassion method process and through my above all else journey of learning to guard and steward my heart, as is talked about in Proverbs 4:23, if there's anything that I have learned, it is, or anything that I've really grown in, it's in awareness of when I'm triggered. So, and that helps me tremendously because knowledge is power. And this is a case where knowing that can help me start to, okay, I'm not going to just keep feeding this trigger. I'm going to start working the process that I learned throughout the compassion method to take care of the trigger. As I work through the compassion method that Laura developed and teaches, I broke it down into 3 simple steps to help me to help me make sense of it. The first one is awareness. Learning to become aware when you're in your trigger. Learning to become aware when your primal brain has taken over and you no longer have access. The second one is comfort. Learning how to bring comfort to your triggered self. Because if you think about it, your triggered self is in that fight or flight, frantic state. But if you can bring comfort to it, you can come back to yourself, engage your frontal lobe. You can come back to yourself. So think about a drowning man. And one of the big rules, they say if a person's drowning, is that you can't just swim up to them to try to help them because they'll drown you. You could be an expert swimmer, and in their franticness, they will drag you right down with them. They have to be calm. And once they can get calm, if a person that's struggling and drowning can get calm, even if they don't know how to swim, they can find that their body actually floats. That keeping your head above the water is work, but not nearly as much work as when we're stuck in that frantic state. And that is exactly the situation with us when we're in our triggered space. If we can bring calm, if we can calm down, if we can come back to ourselves, we'll start to connect with that frontal lobe and we'll start to recognize that, hey, this argument we just had isn't really about Starbucks. It's not really even about the dishes not being done. It's about something deeper inside my heart that those things are pressing on. And I want to go after the deeper. Because at the core, that's learning to steward your heart. That's guarding your heart. It's about befriending your depths and going deep and seeing what's really under the hood. And you're going to learn that there's much more to your story. You're not just a grumpy or irritable person. You're not someone who's just over the top. You're not too much. You're not all these things that your triggered behavior presents. There's a reason why that behavior is presenting. There's something more going on. That second step is learning to provide comfort. And then the third step that we'll talk about more in the next episode is discovery. Learning to discover who you truly are. Your triggered self is not who you are. They're just behaviors. They're just what happens when your pain is running the show. Your true self, that's who you are. And that's what we'll talk about in the next episode. So a real practical tip on just how to start to begin, and I talk some about some of these in the book, but here's just a few. Here's a few things for me that I've learned to recognize when I've fallen into triggered behavior. Number one thing I've noticed is that my whole body kind of heats up. And I'll even notice some sweat starting to trickle down my back. And I first noticed this, as I was learning all of this, I had a kind of a tense phone call, and I got off the phone call and I just kind of recognized that, my back is wet. What's going on? And I was like, oh, okay. I went into my primal brain. I went into fight or flight on that call. And that's one of my indicators. Another big one for me is when I can't see any hope in a situation, when I get stuck in hopelessness. That is a huge dead giveaway for me that I am in my triggered brain. That's a big one for me. Next week, we're going to talk about the part of you that was never broken, your true self. The trigger is just the door. The full map, every chapter, every turning point is in Above All Else. The link and to learn more is in the description. Until then, thank you.